So, Greg, you're all of a sudden, in the span of basically 4 years, you went from being the newest commissioner in the Power Five, if you want to call it that, A5, to now you're the most senior, and not obviously in age, but Jim's now with the ACC. Tony Petitti was just announced as the brand new commissioner for the Big Ten, George Kalavkov in the Pac-12, and obviously Brett Yormark. What I think is fascinating is now all of a sudden you and Jim Phillips are the minority in terms of your background and coming through the system, almost being kind of a promotion from within. I know Jim came from being a Big Ten athletic director, but now the others have come from different sectors, and it's, I'm sure, provided some interesting conversations when all of you guys, and you haven't talked with Tony about this yet, but when you guys all sit down and you start talking about the structure of something like the college football playoff, which you've been working on now for years, how do you get them up to speed, and how much new influence from someone outside of the industry helps your perspective?
The beginning of the question, you gave the half-empty perspective. I'm like the longest tenured at this point, or maybe that means I'm the closest to like transition away. Maybe my time, and it is interesting because there was a period of time. Jim had a 30-year run. John Swofford, 20 plus years.
You're talking about Jim Delaney,
John Swofford, Mike Sly, 13 here, but 10, 11, 12 in different conferences. Mm-hmm. Larry Scott was in the double digits, and as was Bob Bowlesby. So all of those guys who'd been in rooms together, Larry being the one outsider, you're right, it's changed. And I think that can be helpful, different perspectives. So somebody comes from running big events around casinos, you understand that business in a different way as sports gambling emerges or big events. Somebody runs an NBA team. Somebody works in broadcast media or head of or in the office of the commissioner of Major League Baseball. So I think it's helpful to gain even more perspectives. There's a lot of like, why did you do this? So there's opportunities for dialogue. We should all value those, mm-hmm. And use those to educate each other. Those of us who've been around a little bit saying, well, why was this decision made? And why do you operate in this way? And why is it so heavily regulated? And why can't we just make a decision like that and affect change? And as we're asked those questions, we should think about, actually, some of that's a really good point. Yeah. So I think it could be an opportunity for even greater collaboration as we think through things. I particularly look forward to the communication with Tony. We know him a bit from his time with CBS. I got to spend time with he and the commissioner of Major League Baseball and some of the staff in a meeting, and he'll have a lot to do and a lot to catch up because it's a busy time. None of us get to ease into these jobs any longer.
No.
And I think George and Brett and Jim will all tell you that, and Tony would tell you that as well after a few months.
What in a perfect world, how would you like to see the playoff look in 26? Obviously, I call it kind of the Band-Aid expansion in 24 and 25.
That's fair.
Right.
If we get some sponsorship money for that.
Yeah, that's right. Throw it out. But in 26, you have a much more clean palette to operate from and slate to operate from. What do you want to see?
I'll go back to the evaluation of the model that was directed by the presidents, focused on 26. So thank you for reading that press release with intent. And then if possible, expand early. And so a lot of work and a lot of attention on the early expansion. I think rightly so. We need to be thinking about 26 because that's tomorrow.
Sure it is.
In our work. What I would like to see is the ability to have some cleanliness to the conclusion of the current set of agreements. And that's with the broadcaster, with the bowl games, with the other entities attached, so that we can then make decisions in the marketplace fully. I think that's really, really healthy for the game of college football. So that's big picture. From the standpoint of the whens, I do think we have to look at the calendar. And that's the discussion we had about the year-long calendar.
And that also means location,
particularly
too,
when
right?
you
calendar and location.
Place games, yeah. And then when those games are played at the end of the season, that then leads into sites, date, sites, times. I do think there has to be some spacing, particularly at that time of year, because of travel, which will be different. And that's both for fans and participants. And then recovery and preparation.
Yeah.
If we go back to the fall of 2018, particularly December of 2018, was, to me, a really important moment. So we'd had selection. We had some teams left out that people were adamant should have been in. And the cries for expansion increased from within the system. And by within the system, I mean within the 5 conferences,
That's right.
Really from former colleagues. We went to a meeting in Santa Clara. The president said, it's too early to be predicting anything. We're going to create a review, and the presidents will decide. And you fast forward, and at the end of it, the presidents were the ones who decided. So that was fulfillment. And then in between, we tried to think about with a small subcommittee rather than a group of the whole. And all of that was divulged. There were no secrets about who was on. And you had a reluctant participant, me, who said, 4's fine. You had others.
Yeah, it's been amazing for you guys.
Yeah, we can go up and I'll polish off my 6 trophies if you want. Out of
6, take me back to 06, right?
No, they go all the way back then. And you think about the number of teams since 98. So in 25 years, that was Tennessee's victory in the national championship, in LSU, in Florida, in Alabama, in Auburn. And now we're seeing what's happening with Georgia. The number of teams that have captured national championships out of this league is remarkable.
Sure,
and that's unique.
Sure it is.
That is part of what sets us apart. So we didn't have to expand. And I meant that. Even after we announced the additions of Oklahoma and Texas, I'm still comfortable staying at 4. I don't think we're going to have fewer teams in the 4 than we've had. But the feeling was that we weren't building upon the existing health of college football to the future health of college football, particularly because you really have an entire segment of the country not involved in the national championship, and that's the West Coast.
And it's not even the national championship, I would argue. It's even maybe more brought access to it. I've argued that
that's
the 12...
what I mean. The national championship event, just to be clear.
Correct. And I've argued...
Can I just add?
Sure.
That I think for us, even in the Southeastern Conference footprint, Bryce Young is from California.
Yep.
We have players from Washington, from Oregon, and they're all invited, by the way, from Arizona, from Utah. We've had players from the Big Sky Conference region. We want college football and high school football to be as strong as possible across the country. And I think that's why the access, to your point, is really important.
That's right.
To be in the national championship event, to be in that playoff. And
I've argued that more programs need to be able to define themselves as successful. So for so many years in college football, you could define yourself as successful for going to a bowl game or even the level of bowl game. I've argued that Wisconsin's a great example of this. They've never competed for a national championship, and yet they were able to build a program through this definition of success based on New Year's Day Bowl, Rose Bowl, and that elevated the stature of their program. I do think that has been almost eliminated from the sport outside of the 4 participants in the playoff. Even those prestigious bowl games from the past can't necessarily define you as successful for recruits, maybe even some of your fan base. So an expansion to 12, at least in my estimation, are we going to get a lot of different champions? I'm not sure. Maybe in 6 years. However, you got a lot more teams being able to define themselves as successful and being able to recruit on that level, which I think should, at least hopefully, expand some of what has happened in college football in terms of the domination that we've seen from 6 or 7 schools.